Only science enables you to understand the workings of the world. I don't care as you philosophers reflect upon the discoveries of science, but you're not going to find out anything just by sitting there thinking about it.
But even that is a statement of, that is a philosophical statement that you just made.
No,
that's a statement of scientific realism.
There's plenty of evidence in the past that the Greeks sat about thinking about the universe. Look where it got them. Fascinating. They got them into the history books, didn't get them into the science books. It was only when Galileo came along and his successors, and people started to do experiments to see what the world really looked like, rather than just what they thought it ought to look like.
But in seeing what the world really looked like, Professor Atkins, don't you see that you are assuming a philosophical position about science, namely scientific realism? If you're an anti-realist, then you would say, well, science doesn't really tell us anything about the world.
Starting to emerge.
Well, let's rephrase the question like this. Is your position then, Professor Atkins, that science, not only, as you say in your book, is the only way to answer the questions about the nature of reality, but that science doesn't even need to assume anything philosophical in order for the scientific project itself to work, that science kind of supports itself, as it were, as a project of understanding?
Yeah, I absolutely think that. I think certainly the sciences give food for philosophical thought, but I don't think philosophers give much food for scientific thought.
Okay, so, and would you agree that science can be a self-supporting enterprise of understanding reality? Doesn't the very success of science, for example, justify doing science?
Well, now that's a different question. Justify doing science? Yes, certainly there can be a pragmatic justification. But Professor Atkins and I think, are both after questions of truth. Not just does science work. I mean, that is a philosophy of science, namely instrumentalism or operationalism. Stephen Hawking, in his recent book, The Grand Design, adopts this kind of operationalist view. He says we develop models of reality, but they're just more or less useful. They really tell us nothing about the way the world is.
Well, that's absolute nonsense, isn't it?
Well, I agree, it's nonsense, but that's a philosophical point of view.
Okay, we have a few more issues to try and cover in the short amount of time that we have. So moving on from matters of science and epistemology to actually look at some of these arguments that were mentioned tonight. I thought one very interesting point that Professor Atkins made against your cosmological argument, Bill, was this point about you can't invoke causality in trying to explain why there is a universe, why the universe began, and so on, because causal laws depend upon there being a universe in existence, which it describes, and so you can't invoke causal laws when there is no universe being assumed.
Yeah, this is a mistake. Sometimes Professor Atkins speaks as though there were a time when there was nothing, including no causality, but that's philosophically incoherent.
You see? Go ahead.
It's not true that there was a time when there was nothing. The point is that time itself had a beginning before which there wasn't anything. When we say there was nothing before the universe began, we don't mean there was something before it, and it was nothing. What we mean is there wasn't anything before it. The universe came into being, and the question is, does that require a transcendent cause, or can the universe just pop into being without a cause? And it seems to me that causality is a metaphysical principle, not just a sort of law of gravity or law of thermodynamics, which governs being as being, and being doesn't come from non-being. Being only comes from being.
Well, presumably you would think that causality can only be a scientific principle because philosophy is not the way to go here. So you can only invoke causality in a scientific sense from your viewpoint. Is that correct?
Well, absolutely. I mean, philosophical arguments about there being a metaphysics before there was a universe seems to be absolute nonsense again. The answer to the inception of the universe will not come from sitting on our backsides and thinking about what might have happened. It will come from assembling evidence and building a model and seeing whether the model actually results in this observed universe. And when scientists have done that, philosophers will say, oh yeah, we didn't think of that. We see now. So philosophers will always follow where science has led.
Well, I mean...
That's so naive. I mean, that is really a naive view of science and of philosophy. Science is replete with philosophical assumptions that make science possible. And that's why I said before, the person who thinks that he isn't doing philosophy or has no need of philosophy is the person who's going to not understand his own philosophical assumptions that he tacitly makes and therefore is uncritical of them.
One or two last issues I think we can cover before we have to start clearing the hall, unfortunately. You said in your closing speech, Professor Atkins, that these pastors that you mentioned who'd convinced some Christians to stop taking their medication...
It wasn't in my closing speech, but it was...
Sorry. You mentioned these pastors who convinced people to stop taking their medication. You said that these were evil people. Yeah. When you claim that they're evil people, I'd like to clarify, because we didn't quite get onto this point about morality. Do you mean objectively evil or subjectively evil?
I mean, they're a nasty bunch, and that they shouldn't have done what they did because it ruined the lives of people that they were in power over, and I regard that as a kind of evil.
Right, yes, but is this more than something... You talked about the evolution of morality and then human reflection and so on, but there's nothing outside of that in terms of moral standards that you judge people's actions by, in your view?
Yeah, I think it's objectively immoral to kill people, because I think what has emerged through evolution is a stable society when, on the whole, you don't kill your neighbour. I mean, if you'd started to, if there was a tribe where the mores were that you killed your next door neighbour every Thursday morning, then that tribe would disappear after a few weeks. But our morality has led to stability. We've got a way of living in a complex, interactive society.
So, Professor Craig, you can have objective morals because it is objectively the case that behaving this way is the only way to have a stable, thriving, flourishing society. So there is an objectivity to morals without God?
That just is to say that the herd morality that has emerged among Homo sapiens has utility in the struggle for survival. And no one would deny that there are conditions under which Homo sapiens flourish if they have these kind of social interactions. But that's true also of pigs, of elephants, of any kind of...
We can also think about the consequences of actions, and that's the difference. It's not just red and tooth in claw. It's our being able to reflect upon what's going to happen. No group of pigs has invented its own national health service. This group of pigs has.
Well,
because we can see that it's socially cohesive.
The antisocial person who rejects the values that you're suggesting isn't on this view doing anything objectively wrong. He's just going contrary to the social mores that have developed. But there isn't any sort of binding nature on these social mores apart from what the people themselves think.
That's why they're so different in different parts of the world.
Exactly, and that lands us in socio-cultural relativism, as I said. Without a transcendent foundation, one culture's values are just as good as another's.
But people in Saudi Arabia would think that there is another transcendental reason for cutting off people's hands, whereas you don't. And I would be inclined to be on your side in these matters.
Good, but then on an atheistic view, it's very difficult to see why these Islamic radicals are wrong. They just have a different...
Because, if I were to try to summarize my own modus operandum. It would be that I do not want to obtrude into the lives of others. I don't want to quench other people's aspirations, would be better put. Now, I agree that leads you into all sorts of questions about universalism, because I think it was probably quite good of me, actually, to have interfered in the life of Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
So I do draw the line somewhere. But on the whole, I think a good way of getting through life is not to thwart the aspirations of others.
That's what you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He thwarted a lot of aspirations.
Yeah. Fine. Right. Looking at my watch, it's really unfortunate that we don't have more time to extend this interesting conversation, but perhaps it is nice that we ended on something of a note of agreement about the view on at least one premise of one of the arguments that have been covered this evening. Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to our debaters.